Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Travel Podcast, brought to you by GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Stacey. Today, we are... I'm sorry. We're talking about Bolivia today, and in looking up Bolivia, and I didn't type this in on purpose, but this is just somehow one of the first things that I came up for me about Bolivia, and it was actually in an article just about traveling to Bolivia, was the part from John Oliver's Last Week Tonight about the Bolivian zebras, which if you haven't seen this is actually quite fun, because just the idea, there are these sort of crosswalk zebras to help traffic in Bolivia, because Bolivian people, I guess, tended to sort of drive really fast and go through red lights at crosswalks or something, and so it's to make them sort of stop, because yes, I don't know what to do with the zebra that's standing in the way of my car, so yes, I'll stop. But then it's also coming from sort of a pun, because the word for crosswalk is zebra for actually a lot of places, I guess, but we say crosswalk, and I had never heard that before. But then John Oliver thought that the zebras were so great, he put them on green screens and started, photoshopping them into different clips, and that's a whole other thing. So we're going to get off that. I will try and come back to Bolivia. So Bolivia is in South America, and it's actually a landlocked country, although there's a contentious history about that. It's surrounded by Brazil to the northeast, Peru to the northwest, Chile to the southwest, and Argentina and Paraguay to the south. And one of the things that a lot of travel things will tell you about Bolivia is about altitude. It has a very differing climate, from humid to tropical, cold to semi-arid, varying with altitude and climate zone. And a good portion of the country, at least the parts that tourists tend to go to, is in higher altitude. So altitude sickness is something that a lot of people have to deal with when they go to Bolivia, and we'll talk about a little bit more later. And rather than a traditional 4 seasons, Bolivia really just only kind of has 2. Dry and wet, which is kind of similar to where I live in California, except it's not dry and wet so much as hot and not as hot, or hot. It is actually, it's not cold in winter, like, cold, frigid cold. And this is the reason a good portion of people moved to California decades ago. It doesn't snow too much where I live. It snowed a few times, but it doesn't get too cold in the winter. It's just cold to me, because this is what I used to. But then if I went to somewhere where it, snowed all winter, I'd be like, oh my gosh, what is this place? We have 2 seasons. Bolivia has 2 seasons, but they're different. The dry season in Bolivia generally begins in May and ends in late November, with the wet kind of covering the rest of the year. But the sort of most regular and heavy rains tend to fall between January and March. Although in the past few years or so, the seasons have been sort of delayed more and more each year, most likely due to climate change. The population of Bolivia, it is very multi-ethnic. It has indigenous people, mestizos, Europeans, African descendants, and Asians. But interestingly, though Spanish is the official language, Bolivia actually recognizes 36 indigenous languages as official languages. And there are approximately 3 dozen native groups totaling approximately half of the Bolivian population, which is the largest proportion of indigenous people in Latin America, which is, on the one hand, wow. And on the other hand, almost kind of shocking, just because most certainly in America, that's not really possible, because we, and by we, I mean like early Americans, rather seriously killed off a good number of indigenous people. So for a country to be made up majority made up in the majority of indigenous people is just sort of like, I did not even know you could do that in the modern day era. Can I go there now? Like, I need to learn more about this and how this came to be, because it just, from what the strange history I clearly learned in school, I didn't think that was possible. So Bolivia is because it's in Latin America, it's one of the, it has a colonial history, we'll just say. But even after the colonial history, it was sort of contentious a bit with its neighbors. There was a conflict, sort of, because Bolivia did at one point actually have a coastline, and then something happened with Chile, I believe, and now Bolivia does not. But that's still, I think, somewhat of a sore subject for some people in Bolivia. It does, however, have one of the lowest crime rates in Latin America. And one of the things Bolivia is really well known for is, A, alpacas, and B, women in bowler hats. But beyond that even is, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the word at the moment, sort of folk dancing. That's not quite what I meant, but of different cultural dances that I'm still blanking on the word for. There are a number of them, and if you type in like Bolivia folk dance or indigenous dance or something, you can sort of get a rundown of the different names of them and look at the pictures with the different costumes, and some of them have masks. And interestingly, for considering that sort of the not stereotypical, but like touristy on a postcard sort of image that people often have of Bolivian women in the traditional wear with the bowler hats, the dance wear for women can be a bit not that at times. The dresses that women wear for some of these dances can be rather short, showing a lot of leg, to the point that when I first came across the pictures, I did not think they were actually like authentic Bolivian dances. I thought this was someone saying it's Bolivian and it's not, and sort of, excuse my language, bastardizing the culture. And they kind of looked like, we're going to put on a show version of what we think the culture is, but that is evidently the actual dresses that Bolivian women wear for some of the dances. Others do have the traditional dance wear, but yeah, it was quite interesting to see. So with Bolivia, like I said, it's parts of it very, very high. Altitude sickness can be a thing. And if you have never experienced altitude sickness, just do be prepared when you go into it, because that can really suck. I lived in Santa Fe for about a year and a half while I was in school, and Santa Fe is around 7,300 feet or so. It's on a high desert plateau, which throws people off because it's like, it's the desert. It's like, yeah, but it's on a high plateau, so it also snows. But going there at first with the altitude sickness, I was just like, why? Like, I am like chugging water, but I had a headache for like 3 weeks because it took my body that long to sort of acclimate to the much higher altitude. And that actually, I remember while I was there reading an article where they were talking about runners from, I can't remember what country, but I believe they were African, came to Santa Fe to train for the Olympics, because I believe they were for the Olympics that were held in Brazil, because the Olympics were going to be held in a location that had a high altitude. And so they wanted to prepare their body to get used to that, of having to run in that really high altitude thing where there's less oxygen, and the conditions are very much changed. And it's just like, wow. I mean, so that is one of the things that probably pretty much any travel site you go to looking at Bolivia will warn you about is to be prepared for high altitude and altitude sickness. And if you're going to Bolivia, to sort of take the time and space things out a bit and don't try and rush through whatever site you're trying to see, partly just because there's so much to see in some of these places, but also partly to give your body that time to get used to the altitude of wherever you're going. Because if you're quickly like, okay, I only have a day, let's just go, I'm coming in from somewhere else completely and I'm going out the next day, you're probably going to feel really terrible because your body's just going to be like, I don't know how to do this and I haven't taken the time, and oh, okay, and then we leave the next day. Yeah, that was a crappy place. Let's never go back there. So if you are planning to go to Bolivia, just be forewarned about the altitude sickness. So we're going to take a short break. Stay tuned.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Travel Podcast. So the place I really want to go, and I picked Bolivia almost solely for this destination instead of being like, hey, I really want to go to this country. I want to go solely to this place, which is, I'm going to try and pronounce this, but it's been many years since I took Spanish, so I might be off. The Salar de Uyuni, which sometimes translated as Sky Mirror. But the Salar de Uyuni is, I'm sorry, not Sky Mirror. That's only at certain times. I apologize. It's the salt flats in a part of Bolivia. But the reason I'd want to go, and the reason I said Sky Mirror, is during some times of the year, which is during the wet season after it's rained, it can have this sort of mirror effect. And the images for this are just stunning. So the Salar de Uyuni as a whole is actually Bolivia's #1 attraction, irregardless of the year. It's the world's largest salt flat, and it lies at 11,800 feet. So like I said before the break, altitude sickness, just be forewarned. Bolivia has the highest salt flats, lake, administrative capital city, golf course, Irish pub, road, and cable car in the world. And that's not like we've just got to break the record. That's just a lot of us is high, and we happen to have those things. So there you are. So the Salar de Uyuni is the salt flats, and it's at that height. If you go during the dry season, it looks not quite like the Sky Mirror, but also quite stunning in its own way. It, when it's dry, can break into these sort of natural hexagonal, not plates, but sections or what have you. And it's just very like strange desert, almost like no desert you think you've ever seen before. It's just bare and barren and white. And they do warn you, if you're going to go, to take sunscreen and sunglasses and a hat, because the sun can just be blinding off of those salt flats. But if you go during the wet season, which is between December and March, but they say that like sort of the best time is when the torrential rains come between like January and March or so. And again, since seasons are being delayed, that might be a bit hard to plan with. If you go after it's rained, you will have this sort of flooded mirror surface, because then there's the water on the salt flats. And since the salt flats are that, bright white salt sand, what have you, the water on that sort of acts like a mirror. If you've ever seen how mirrors, especially older mirrors, are made, where it's the glass over the sort of silver backing or what have you, and that's what allows for the reflection. This sky mirror effect is amazing. Like when I first saw, again, I guess pictures in Bolivia just don't seem real to me or something. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, that's a green screen. That's like from a movie. I've seen that in some movie where that's a green screen they're walking on and you did that mirror effect, but that's not real. And then it is. You can tell because some of the pictures are at a certain angle so that rather than just seeing the reflection of the sky or the person or whoever, it's at an angle enough that you can actually kind of see the salt flat through the water. And so you can see, that's what it's on, and it's not just a mirror. But the pictures of this are stunning, and I remember I saw a picture with like a couple holding hands, and I'm like, I don't even care that much if ever I got married to have like the sort of staged wedding and or honeymoon photos, but I would kind of want to go there just for that. For the salt flats, to have that sort of like, oh, we just got married and enter this picture here because it's just that beautiful. There are a number of tours that do the salt flats at different times of the year, and they leave from different places around them. One leaves from Uyuni, the town. There are a couple of other towns they leave from. Interestingly, in Bolivia, even though, especially with the salt flats, this is the number one attraction, it can be kind of not luxurious, I'll say, to travel there. That's supposedly changing in the coming future. There are a couple of sort of luxurious, or as close as you can get as a luxurious on a salt flat, accommodation sites that are being set up. But they talk about how, it's very cold in Bolivia because of the altitude. So you want to pack, especially during the dry season, plenty of warm clothes and probably a sleeping bag because most Bolivian hotels don't have heat. And for a lot of these trips to the salt flat, you kind of travel on bus, and sometimes the bus windows can't shut, and even if they can, they don't have heat. So you're traveling possibly at night with really cold temperatures that, definitely drop below negative, and you could just be absolutely freezing. And since the hotels don't have heat, even if you're like in your room, which is often very basic and just sort of a twin bunk and maybe providing you with food, but then the food might be very basic. I can imagine if you'd spent like all day traveling and then you get there and you're freezing at night because you weren't prepared. That would be a really miserable traveling experience and not something you'd probably want to do on purpose. So just the idea that you should be prepared when traveling to Bolivia, that very beautiful, but not the sort of, high standard travel, luxurious setting that you may be used to from other places. But they do also say that because of that, you have to be sort of open, and this is part of why they suggest, don't try and blitz through Bolivia in a day or so, or don't even try and blitz through the salt flats in a day. Like the recommended tour time for the salt flats is 3 days, and that involves several hours and a bumpy Jeep with, again, possibly no heating, but that because, amongst other things, travel can be very unpredictable and not really on a schedule in Bolivia, you kind of just sort of have to learn to go with the flow, I guess. And so if the bus breaks down and there's not another bus for hours, that's kind of just part of the experience. And that once you learn to just sort of go with what happens without being like, I'm on a set schedule, I've got to go, you would have a much greater chance of enjoying your time in Bolivia. But that both to be open and flexible, but also to be prepared. So on both hands, because I imagine no matter how open and flexible you are, if you've been freezing all night and then you don't really get a good meal and possibly not even a warm meal, you might be very cranky. They do also recommend various travel sites that I saw to bring water, because sometimes tours will provide you some, but even if they provide you some, it's often not enough, because again, this is not quite a desert, but kind of a desert. It looks like a desert in many places. You get the sun, you don't have any shade, You don't have any cover, so you will get dehydrated just from that, especially if, you know, you're doing a lot of walking or traveling or what have you. Just, it's a sort of backpacker's paradise, and I think a mountain biker's paradise. There is evidently a road in Bolivia called Death Road, which automatically is like the road I never want to go to, but a lot of backpackers and mountain bikers have gone through and said it was great, and it's sort of like the highlight of their travels. It's a definite more roughing it, but not roughing it camping style, roughing it like literally roughing it as you rough around the world sort of style trip and country and what have you. And if that's not your cup of tea, that's fine. But just so you don't go there and think you're going to get like, you know, the same thing you'd get if you go to Manhattan. Definitely not. Do not think you're going to be staying in like a 4-star hotel or anything like that. It is much more for the rough and tumble, down for anything sort of people. So we're going to take another break. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Travel Podcast. Our tip for today, interestingly, is almost not an exact opposite of Bolivia, but because things in Bolivia can be so non-expensive, this tip's not the most useful for Bolivia, but it did make me think of it, which is that if you want to go to an expensive restaurant, you probably should want to go during lunch, because many restaurants offer lunch specials, which is often the same food as dinner, but around roughly half the price. Again, in Bolivia, this doesn't quite matter because things are so non-expensive there that you can actually just sort of be like, I'm going to the really fancy restaurant that I might not be able to go to in other countries because it's really not going to cost me as much to do so in Bolivia. But if you're going in other places where that's actually a major factor that could affect whether or not you even go to that restaurant, try to go during lunch and see if they have a lunch special that will save you some money. And our site for today is tripit.com, which I love because I just imagine that if I didn't do this, I'd kind of get lost on things, especially if I was trying to sort of inform other people. Because I've heard a lot of people who travel a lot say they like create an itinerary on like Google Docs or something, and they only give the password to certain people who need to know where they're going to be at certain times for like safety reasons. So it's like, hey, if I don't show up in such and such a country by such a day, be worried and call the local embassy or whatever. Or if you don't hear from me these few days, well, that's fine because I'm out in the middle of nowhere with no cell phone reception. But if you don't hear from me by this other day, that's something to be concerned about, so that people know where you are, when to expect that you are, you know, reachable, and when you're just incommunicado, and not to freak out. And especially like my family would probably be like, yes, tell us where you're going and when. What time does your flight leave? What time does your flight get? It's like, you're not going to be there. It's what I don't care. Tell me when your flight is. Okay, geez. So TripIt.com basically is like a self-organizing, I wanted to say online secretary, but that's not quite it at all. It organizes everything for you into an itinerary that you can access. So you forward to TripIt your confirmation emails for things like flights and hotels and what have you to plans@tripit.com, and it automatically records them into this master itinerary that you can see, and it gives you things like confirmation numbers and what have you. So you're like, okay, so looking at my itinerary, I leave on this flight at such and such a day on such a time, and I get in here such and time, whatever, and I've got a reservation. Because a lot of times, especially if you're sort of looking for the best deal, those things, your flight, your hotel, your car rental, if you've got like especially if you've got like a restaurant reservation, because those are kind of separate, all those sort of things can be in numerous different places from numerous different sites, and it can be kind of confusing to try and keep track of that. If it's like, okay, this is in this email, but this is in this email, or I have to go to this site to check what my flight is, but then for car rental, I did it over here because it was cheaper and I can't remember. That can be kind of confusing, especially if you're not really an organized person. I am an organized person, so I would probably like have this written down somewhere, but I also kind of don't want to have it written down in case I lose that. If that's like the one thing I lose, that's a dangerous thing for me to have lost and other people to know. If I lose my phone, I'm already like, completely screwed anyways. So I'm minimizing the number of things in losable situations. That's not a words. My speaking today is all sorts of crazy, but you get the idea. So TripIt.com organizes everything, and it's also pretty easy to sort of make changes to things if you want to. It also keeps previous itineraries. So if you take a trip somewhere and you had a really good time and you really liked that hotel or that restaurant or whatever, and you want to either go back and do it again, or someone is taking a trip there and they asked you for recommendations, you're like, oh, there was this great hotel. It was right over the park. And what was that name? It's got like this great front entrance. And what was that? You don't really have to remember that. TripIt has it there and it will remember it for you, even though this is not the current trip you're on. And so you can just be like, okay, let me go to my TripIt account and be like, yes, that trip I took at whatever time. Okay, going through my itinerary. There it was. It was the Grand. I know, random hotel name is random. But you get the idea. Having all your stuff organized in one place without having to go through the hectic, crazy madness beyond my organizational skills. Do I need to hire a personal organizer or go onto some reality show about organizing sort of situation? Very simple. Just forward the emails to this email thing. They put it together for you. You have it all there in one easily accessible, organized place. Again, I'm not very organized, but I would kind of be like, if certain members of my family ever went anywhere, I'd be like, you have to use this. I will like sit on you and you will not be able to go to your flight unless you use this thing, so that I know that you know what you're doing when, and won't get on the wrong flight or go to the wrong country or any of that. Like, you're not organized at all, and I don't trust you to do this yourself. So use this site that does it for you and like link me in so I can see, so that I don't have to freak out about this, because I will just call and bug you constantly on your vacation if I don't feel sufficiently secure that you know what you're doing. Sorry. I care. It's because I care that I go crazy. I'll just say that. On that very loving note, we're going to end for today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Travel Podcast.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From travel to health and wellness to entertainment and life and happiness to sex and relationships. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast.